All right, welcome back to part 2 of our week 1 asynchronous dialogue for COM 2113, Media Culture and Social Influence. We're taking student questions. We're kind of processing them with varying levels of complexity and nuance and just kind of celebrating the readings that we're working through in the class. We're giving students a reward system, right? We're certainly wanting to recognize your thoughts matter. Your time and labor invested in the readings matter. And too often, especially even in hyper-accelerated educational circumstances, and the complexities students face today, you know, people are always looking, not all people at all, but certain student populations look for ways to kind of discount reading or discount the act of reading or discount the ideas that come from reading. And definitely those of us that have been through the rigors of higher education understand that. I mean, reading's a valuable tool, and you don't learn something by being exposed to it once. You don't learn something overnight, and you really have to process things to absorb them. And so this is our way. We have it as an assignment to kind of actively integrate those readings, so that we're not just casually leaving them, tossing them to the side to collect dust. And we don't want that for you. We hope we hope there's at least one, and ideally more than one, key reading that's going to stick with you, that's going to have some transformative power for you. So we're looking at questions. I have another question from Jennifer that I want to tackle here, coming from the Cultural Studies Primer Part 2 video that we laid out for students in week 1. And Jennifer writes, the creator of the video correctly stated that the processes of reflecting cultural practices and codes are often, quote, passive, indirect, or implied, rather than asserted outright, end quote. Question is, why do you think that is? Why are our processes of reflecting on cultural practices and codes often passive, indirect, or implied? And I think this is just a great opportunity to pause and think about the nature of communication, right? We're tying it right into the key course theme here and thinking about, well, do we learn how to function, behave as humans, actively or passively, right? Or majority of the things we pick up in life. And hey, this is a video about cultural studies, and this course incorporates cultural studies. So let's think about culture as our example. Let's try to be narrow and concrete in our focus here. Do we pick up culture passively or actively? Right? We pick up certain educational qualities in school, and maybe like you think of this idea of children sitting down with pencils and learning to engage with sight words, or to write, reading and writing, or maybe solve math like physically by hand, and those are active modes of education. But even what we prioritize as education, all right? So let's take the U.S., for example. What we prioritize as education, STEM, right? We have all these kind of, whether it's an acronym or keywords, our maths, our sciences, our what have yous, or perhaps tech skills, right? Trade schools, technology institutes, and so on have specific hard skills that we're focused on there. But we know there's many soft skills as well. And in fact, a lot of our cultural practices, cultural beliefs, cultural values are soft skills to a certain extent. And we learn them through observation, not necessarily through kind of physical skill sets. And so if we think about that, how much of what we understand about culture do we just absorb in a passive, indirect, or implied way? Well, let's translate that to media, and mass media in particular, right? We're using entertainment as a lens to understand how we process all these concepts in this course. And if we take how we consume entertainment, let's think about one of the most classical modes in the 20th century for consuming entertainment, right? So in the 20th century, one of the most popular forms to take hold in the US, but as a global experience, is going to the movies, right? And what is that experience like? Now, we're physically getting out or going to a specific offsite location. It's a kind of social experience. It's a kind of ritual. And it comes with many sub-rituals, right? The gathering of the snacks, right? The selecting of the seats and so on. But when we sit down, we're kind of, we're consuming the snacks, the what have yous, right? And we're taking it in. What happens? The lights dim down, right? And so, the screen lights up, the curtain pulls back. And we're taking in this feature, right? This feature film, this cinematic experience. And cinema can be very engaging, but a lot of it's cognitive, right? It's this sort of engaging in the senses, and we're processing it cognitively. But like a lot of people will say, not everyone, but a lot of people will say, oh, I don't go to movies to think, or I don't watch a movie to think. I'm just wanting to take my mind off the world, to escape for a little while. That's why we refer to it as escapism, right? Or suspension of disbelief as the act of us buying into a story, right? Playing along with it as it plays along for us. And so that understanding in that way, it is a passive form of media consumption and of information consumption. And what is cinema? And we could draw on a number of film scholars over the history of film studies, but they would collectively agree, that cinema is a reflection, right? Like art, film and art form, right? And we'll talk about art with Berger's focal points model, right? But film as an art form not only reflects culture, but it creates culture, right? And so this is all this process. We don't go to the movies and we sit and think, all right, it's 3 minutes until I'm gonna create some culture or have some co-created culture presented before me, and I can't wait to see how it changes the way I look at the world and practice my life and view people or circumstances or whatever. Those thoughts aren't going on in the average moviegoer's minds. We're just ready to engage the text, right? Use that term again, text, that we've been introducing on discussion boards and things. But because it's a passive process, because we're taking in that information in a kind of passive circumstance, we're kind of, in a way, submitting to it for the duration and considering it. Oftentimes we believe we're considering it just at a purely surface level, right? Like an amusement park. Hey, when the ride's over, I'm up, my bar lifts, I'm out of here, I'm on to the next line, or I'm going to the restroom or out of the park or whatever. And so sometimes we think about film like that. But it is doing a lot of film, does a lot more complex work than that. And sometimes that complex work is often happening beneath the surface of our recognition of it, okay? And this is what got media theorists so interested in media effects and the dawn of what we now call media studies, right? There was the effect studies for years and years. And this was especially coming out of the mid-20th century when television emerged as this new medium of mass-mediated expression that was no longer exterior to us. It was no longer in that exterior public space, right, that you had to go to engage in. It was within the home, right? It was suddenly in an intimate space, as the book behind me suggests, right? This was a paradigm shift in culture. Culture was now brought to us from outside within the home. And so that nuclear home was, in a sense, invaded, right, in a certain way. And what television in its earliest forms, through very limited number of channels, provided was a kind of very narrow window to the world, but a window to the world nonetheless that gave us exposure to new and different ideas, some of them exciting, some of them terrifying, some of them, funny and charming and engaging. So these kinds of ideas have been circulating, and this is just an example of us understanding that we more often than not, do consume media in a kind of passive, indirect, or implied manner, and not just media, right? Because I'm adjusting the context of the question and the quotation here, but I'm kind of paraphrasing, right? Because this applies to that act of reflecting on cultural practices. I'm just giving us a narrow 1A, 1B examples. First talking about film, then talking about television, of how we do that. Well, here's where it ties into our learning journey, right? Our educational goals in the communication, media, and ethics major at MacU. We have specific educational outcomes. Like, we've forged these list of areas that we're wanting, more than one, we're committing to helping students advance. And one of those key areas, especially for this course, this exact course, COM 2113, a course we're heavily invested in assessing for students, is to shift from passive modes of leisurely media consumption to active modes of critical reasoning. And you all will practice. I hate to spoil, right? I hate to give us the Wizard of Oz ending so early in the class, but I'm going to peel the curtain back. You all will learn how to, even if you leave it at the end of the course, hey, free will, choice, whatever. But you will gain exposure to how you can begin to peel back those layers and shift your own mindset about how you experience, engage media, how we think about media, how we don't just kind of passively allow it in, but instead kind of learn how to critique or stand up kind of in conversation with, or speak out against, or what have you, these mass mediated messages, right? We learn how to become part of the dialogue. We learn how to activate our voice, and that's exciting. I mean, we activate our, spoken voice, but we're learning through assignments to activate our written voices, right? And to find that written voice, especially with so many people have talked about appreciating writing, having goals to become better writers, wanting to become better writers. This is a key quality that we can be working on. So when it suggests that the processes of reflecting cultural practices and codes are often, quote, passive, indirect, or implied, rather than asserted outright, we can agree with this, and thus understand the need for heightened practices and gaining these cognitive, these critical skills, critical thinking based skill sets. They're going to help us, engage mediated messages, culture, and all the ideas and perspectives we encounter. Sit tight. We've got more in store. We're just getting started with the questions, but what a couple of bombshells to kick off our week 1 asynchronous dialogue in media culture and social influence.